The Civil Rights Movement, Part 2. An important part of the legacy of the African American Civil Rights Movement is the way in which it has influenced other civil rights movements. I want to think about civil rights and wrongs, the contested meaning of civil rights. I want to begin not by a major example of a civil rights movement, but with a simple illustration showing how civil rights can be complicated when they overlap with the rights of others. Let's talk about smoking bans, a very controversial subject. Whose rights can we talk about if we're to apply the concept of civil rights to smoking bans? On the one hand, there are the rights of smokers. Secondly, there are the rights of non-smokers to go places and not have to inhale. Thirdly, there are the rights of business owners to decide for themselves whether or not to allow smoking. As you might imagine, rights can be complicated. We have our own spheres of rights, and sometimes, if we aren't careful, we can infringe on the rights of others in the name of our own rights. One part of the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement is the way that other ethnic groups have followed the example of African Americans. Ethnic spin-offs of the Civil Rights Movement include Latinos and Native Americans. There are some ways, however, in which the legacy is more controversial. One example would be the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, getting involved in issues such as separation of church and state. On the one hand, there is the right of people not to be forced not to have a particular religion forced upon them. On the other hand, what about the right of the people to practice their own religion freely? We hear the phrase, "it's a free country," all the time, but it's not quite as simple as that. None of us are free to infringe upon the rights of another, so it can get quite complicated. Sometimes the boundaries are messy between civil rights. Another example is the gay rights movement, particularly since the 1970s. On the one hand, there is a debate about civil unions. There's also debate about hate crimes. Some speak of rights of homosexuals not to be discriminated against and not to face acts of violence. But on the other hand, this becomes a matter of free speech when legislation targets churches, for example, who could be prosecuted for speaking out against what they believe to be immoral. Then there's the women's rights movement. Of course, African American women, excuse me, I'm losing my train of thought. Of course, American women had already been voting since the 1920s. In the 1970s, there was an attempt to pass an Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA for short. Interestingly, this passed in Congress but failed to be ratified by the states, in large part because of the opposition among American women themselves, led by women such as Phyllis Schlafly. American women were concerned that equal rights would in some ways cost them privileges. For example, they feared that they would be eligible for the draft instead of being exempt, or that they would lose an advantage in child custody cases. So the ERA was defeated. In a previous lecture, I discussed the publication by Betty Friedan of The Feminine Mystique. Since that time period, amazing changes have been made for American women. More women than ever are going to college and entering careers, etc. But it's important to note that American women face some significant problems in the modern world as well. In fact, recent surveys suggest that instead of liberation, an increasing number of women say they are unhappy that expanded opportunities have resulted in greater strain rather than fulfillment as they tried to perform double duty with their families and their careers. Some resolve the conflict by choosing not to have families, but many would prefer to have it the other way around. Surveys show that although a majority of moms work outside the home, only about 10% say they want to work full-time, with the rest dreaming of either working part-time or being full-time moms, but often unable to do so because of their financial situation. That's not quite liberation. You've probably seen the internet ads where President Obama is calling on American moms to go back to college. Apparently, many American moms would prefer that the economy were such that they didn't have to. Divorce reform, one of the goals of the women's rights movement for a long time, We now have easy access to no-fault divorce, but the result is an increased rate of broken homes, poverty, and dissatisfaction. The book, The Case for Marriage, makes the case that some of the goals of the women's rights movement, such as divorce reform, have actually been counterproductive to their interests. Another part of the women's rights movement is the debate over reproductive rights. The Supreme Court case, Roe v. Wade in 1973, upheld a woman's right to privacy in having an abortion. The court explained that this decision by suggesting that within the 14th Amendment there was an implied right to privacy, although the language wasn't actually there. This is a good example of the contested meaning of civil rights, because on the other hand there's the argument, what about the rights of the unborn? In this court case, the court said that they didn't know when life begins, and they weren't going to bother trying to answer that question. In their eyes, it was just a legal matter. It's all about personhood to the Supreme Court. Personhood is a legal term. It's not the same as humanity. For example, in the 1800s, there was the Dred Scott Supreme Court case where a black man sued for his freedom. Obviously, Dred Scott was a living, breathing human being, but the Supreme Court denied that he had legal personhood, that he wasn't a citizen that had the right to sue in court. So this is basically the argument that the Supreme Court used in their ruling in Roe v. Wade. They weren't prepared to deny that life began at conception, but they said that legally personhood for the unborn had never been established. Therefore, they would focus on the rights of the mother. Like I said, this is an example of the contested meaning of civil rights. On the one hand, there's the right of a mother seeking an abortion. Also involved are the rights of the unborn. Well, what about the rights of fathers who want to have a part in the decision-making process? Also, more recently, a part of the debate is over a woman's right to know. Some states are trying to pass legislation requiring abortion providers to disclose more information to women as they make that decision. That brings us to one final example of the legacy of the civil rights movement. The Right to Life movement. I want you to notice some similarities. This is like many other civil rights movements in many ways, patterned after strategies of the African American civil rights movement. First, think about organizational structure. Just as the original civil rights movement had many organizations, such as the NAACP, the SCLC, the SNCC, the CORE, this might remind you of the alphabet soup of the New Deal. Well, the Right to Life movement is no exception. There's the National Right to Life and the state organizations. Some groups are focusing on legislation, some focusing on crisis intervention. There's a great presence of the influence of churches in this group, just as there was with the African American civil rights movement. There's an overwhelming focus on nonviolence. Occasionally acts of violence appear, usually not within the mainstream groups, but on the fringe. The same as with the African American civil rights movement. What about strategy and focus? With the African American civil rights movement, some focused on education, some focused on segregation in society, and some focused on political rights. In the Right to Life movement, some focus on legislation, for example, passing state laws that, although they wouldn't overturn Roe v. Wade, would make it more difficult to obtain an abortion, and have been quite effective in bringing down abortion rates. Examples include taking away state funding, parental consent laws, informed consent, and things like that. Then there are some who emphasize education, abstinence education, for example. There are local crisis pregnancy centers who want to present alternatives such as adoption. Finally, like the African American civil rights movement, this movement also deals with changing issues over time. It's not all about the abortion debate. There's also the debate over embryonic stem cell research and euthanasia. We can certainly talk about many more examples, for example, the animal rights movement, but I think these are enough to illustrate the point that there's a contested legacy of the meaning of the civil rights movement.